Rule 7 said, "Leave your section immediately." For 3 full seconds I stood frozen, no longer sure whether obedience was safety or bait. Simmons whispered, "Run." And somewhere beneath us, deep under the concrete, something answered in my voice, "No." I should have left when the false lockdown came over the speaker. That was the official instruction. Old instinct, older fear. Rule 7 had remained consistent in every version I'd found. If the lockdown announcement came without alarms, get out of your section. Move. Do not wait to confirm. Do not ask questions. Instead, I followed Simmons downward. I can justify it now by saying I believed the lower levels held Daniel or answers or the source of the duplications. All of that was true. But the more honest explanation is that by then the ordinary routes of self-preservation no longer felt available to me. If copies of me were already moving through the institution, if reports were already carrying my face into places I had not been, then staying in the sanctioned part of the prison felt less like survival than surrender. Simmons used a key I had never seen on a door hidden behind a fire hose cabinet in the old utility hall. The cabinet swung wider than its hinge should have allowed, revealing a concrete stairwell descending in a tight spiral. The air rising from below was colder than the prison air above and carried a layered smell. Bleach, rust, wet stone, and something organic underneath. Sweet in the way rot turns sweet when it has gone too far. "How often have you done this?" I asked. He didn't answer until we were 10 steps down. "Often enough to still be here." The stairs opened onto a corridor older than anything else I had seen at Blackridge. The walls were tiled halfway up in institutional green, cracked and crazed with age. Above the tile, the plaster had buckled and split in vertical seams that looked less like damage than growth rings. The lighting came from caged bulbs mounted low and far apart. Their glow left pockets of shadow dense enough to feel structural. Sublevel 7 did not resemble a prison. It resembled a hospital wing designed by someone who no longer believed patients and staff belonged to separate categories. Doors lined both sides of the passage, some steel, some reinforced glass clouded from within. Many had been painted over and relabeled repeatedly. I saw old stenciling under newer black numbers. OBS 3 beneath holding. Quiet room beneath secure intake. At the far end of the corridor stood a nurse's station wrapped in chain-link reinforcement like a cage built around an office. There were sounds below the hum of electricity. Not voices exactly. Repetitions. A phrase half-formed, spoken somewhere distant enough to be absorbed by walls before it reached meaning. Simmons led me to the station and unlocked a drawer. Inside were supply packs, restraint cuffs, protein drinks, medical syringes, and stacks of handwritten forms that had never entered the official system. Feeding schedules, observation notes, behavioral logs. I picked one up. Under subject identification, the line had been filled and crossed out so many times it looked gouged. Daniel Hale appeared twice in different hands. On another form, the same subject number was labeled M. Hale Variant 2. "What is this?" I asked. Simmons rested both hands on the counter. "A compromise." "With who?" "With what's left." I wanted to hit him then. Maybe if I had, the rest would have become simpler. Instead, I listened. He told me Gallomir's isolation program had started with men who reported impossible overlap. Voices answering thoughts, shared dreams with measurable physical aftereffects, patients identifying staff histories they had no access to. The hospital treated it as contagion by suggestion. They isolated the patients more aggressively. Sensory deprivation, rotating staff, observation through barriers. When the incidents intensified, administrators buried them under experimental language and funding requests. Then one patient in the lowest wing stopped behaving like a patient. It began, according to Simmons, with mimicry so trivial no one recorded it properly. Repeated phrases. Reflected gestures. Staff seeing each other where they had not been. Then the copies improved. They retained memory fragments. They learned tone, handwriting, procedural habits. Violence came later, not because violence was the goal, but because replacement required removal. When Blackridge took over, Simmons said, they didn't clear 7. They sealed it and hired around it. And the rules came after. Every batch was based on whatever had worked most recently. Worked how? He looked at me for a long moment. Bought time. I understood then why every older rule set contradicted the previous one. The thing below the prison was not static. It learned by contact. Countermeasures became obsolete as soon as they became predictable. Why keep feeding it? I asked. His face hardened at the word. You think we had a choice? Yes. You think shutting the place down would solve it? You think transfer buses and public hearings and demolition crews would contain something that can wear a face before it understands the person under it? He shook his head. They tried removal once. Lost 14 people in under an hour and reopened 7 with more doors. I held up the forms. So this is what you do? Bring it inmates? Officers. His silence was answer enough. Every generation sacrifices a few officers to keep the entity occupied. The sentence did not come from him directly. It came from the pattern of what he showed me. Attrition reports hidden inside transfer paperwork. Night staff disappearances reclassified as assaults, resignations, family emergencies. Certain inmates routed below because they had seen the wrong thing or had the wrong kinds of memories. Not wholesale slaughter. Management. Feeding enough identity into the system to keep its appetite localized. You've been protecting the prison, I said. Not the people in it. No, Simmons said. I've been protecting what's outside it. That was when I heard a low voice from the room beyond the station say my name. Not Officer Hale. Not some copied call over the intercom. Just Marcus, spoken the way only one person in my life ever had, with the second syllable softened as if it were a private apology. Daniel. I moved before Simmons could stop me. The room at the end of the corridor had once been an observation chamber. Half the glass wall had been replaced with welded steel sheets. The remaining pane was cloudy but not opaque. Through it, I saw a man sitting on a fixed chair under a hanging light, his wrists loose in front of him. His hair had gone longer than any intake unit would allow. His face was thinner, older, but unmistakable now that I had let myself know it. I went cold so fast it felt like sinking. Simmons was saying something behind me. I don't remember what. I only remember the sound of my own breath changing. Daniel raised his head. For one impossible second, relief overrode everything else. The years, the lies, the job. I had found him, not proof of him. Him. Then he smiled in a way I had never seen on my brother's face. Not wrong exactly, just delayed, as if the expression had been assembled from observation rather than instinct. Marcus, he said, you took the long way. I stepped closer to the glass. His eyes tracked me with unbearable precision, and in them I saw the thing Simmons had not managed to explain. The entity below Blackridge did not simply duplicate. It improved through accumulation. Daniel's face was there, yes, but layered with too much attention, too many borrowed versions of recognition. How long have you been here? I asked. He tilted his head. Which answer would help you most? Behind me, Simmons said. Don't ask him questions. Daniel laughed softly. Still giving rules, he said. He was always good at that part. I turned. Open the door. No. He's my brother. Simmons' reply came flat. He was. The corridor lights flickered once. Then every speaker in sublevel 7 came alive at the same time. Lockdown in effect, said a dozen voices, none of them quite synchronized. Some were female, some male. One was mine. The bulbs dimmed. In the glass, behind Daniel's seated reflection, I saw figures gathering in the dark part of the room where there had been no visible space a second earlier. They all had my silhouette. Simmons grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. It knows you know now, he said. That changes the math. And Daniel, if it was Daniel, leaned forward into the light and whispered, with perfect tenderness, it changed the moment you looked in. The collapse began with imitation. Not screams. Not alarms. Not a cinematic riot of sudden violence. The prison came apart the way a sentence comes apart when a single word is repeated too many times and stops meaning itself. Voices echoed where they should not have. Doors cycled without command. Over the radio, officers reported seeing themselves, then cut off mid-transmission. By the time Simmons and I reached the upper connector, Blackridge had split into pockets of contradictory reality. On one tier, inmates were hammering on doors and shouting that officers were inside cells with them. On another, the unit was silent except for a man in the third row laughing until he vomited. The camera monitors in the nearest control alcove showed duplicates in almost every feed. Officers standing motionless beside moving officers, inmates sleeping and awake at once, hallways overlaid on hallways. Rule 7 had gotten us moving, but the movement itself seemed anticipated. Every corridor we took produced another obedient crisis. Secure here. Wait there. Evacuate this section. Hold that gate. The loudspeakers issued instructions in soothing, authoritative tones while the institution underneath them shifted to absorb compliance. That was when I finally understood the problem with every rule ever written for Blackridge. The entity expected caution. It had been shaped by generations of avoidance, appeasement, and controlled responses. It learned from what people did to survive it. It knew how fear moved. It knew where staff would retreat, what doors they would trust, which routes emergency protocol made inevitable. The rules had not just contained it, they had educated it. Simmons still thought in terms of procedure. Even then, he wanted to reach a fallback gate, seal the old connectors, hold until daylight and external response. He was not wrong in any ordinary sense. It was a defensible plan. It was exactly what trained people should do inside a compromised facility, which was why I knew it would fail. We rounded the junction outside lower medical and found 3 officers standing in a line across the corridor, all facing away from us. "Simmons," I said quietly. He stopped. The officers wore standard uniforms. 2 had visible name tags. Mercer, Dole. The third had mine. No one moved. I realized then that none of them were breathing. Simmons raised his radio. "State your post." All 3 officers answered at once, in the same calm tone. "Waiting." My hand closed around the laminated rules card in my pocket. The old one, cracked now, corners soft from sweat. 7 instructions meant to create distance between people and a thing that learned by contact. 7 patterns the thing below us had spent years digesting. I took the card out and tore it in half. Simmons stared at me. "What are you doing?" "Something stupid." "Marcus." He never finished. The officer wearing my face turned first, and the other 2 followed a fraction behind. Their mouths opened slightly too wide, not in attack but in concentration, like people trying to remember how smiles worked. I walked straight toward them. Everything in me screamed not to. Every night shift habit, every corrective instinct, every scrap of reason. But that was the point. Whatever lived beneath Blackridge anticipated evasion. It had cataloged fear into routes and behaviors. It expected a man to avoid his own double. It expected caution to look like intelligence. I shoved past the first copy hard enough that our shoulders collided. His flesh felt warm, real. He flinched. For one beat, one tiny, impossible beat, the thing hesitated. Not physically, systemically. The corridor lights strobed. A door 3 ranges away slammed open and then shut again. The speaker overhead emitted a burst of static like a swallowed scream. "Come on," I said to Simmons, already moving. He swore and followed. From then on I abandoned every rule I had left. I answered questions. I looked where I wasn't supposed to look. I entered sealed areas without waiting for backup. When a voice using my childhood nickname called from an observation room, I answered, "I remember you," though I didn't know if that was true. When a false call light flashed from an empty holding cell, I opened the door and walked through it into a maintenance shaft that should not have existed behind the concrete wall. When I heard a second set of footsteps matching my own, I ran. Each act made the building lurch around me, not because I had mastered it, but because unpredictability introduced noise into a system trained on compliance. The prison no longer felt like a place trying to trap me. It felt like a mind trying to recompute. At some point in the chaos, Simmons stopped arguing. Maybe he saw the same thing I did in the monitors. Copies waiting where protocol would send us, watching exits rather than roaming blindly. Maybe he heard enough of his own voice over the intercom to understand that procedure had become a map provided to the enemy. Whatever the reason, By the time we reached the old freight lift beneath intake, he simply handed me a ring of keys and said, "If there's a center, it's below 7. "There is," I said, though I had no rational way to know that. The certainty had been growing in me all night, a geometric pull beneath fear, as if the prison kept organizing itself around a point no blueprint could show. The lift had no marked lower stop. The panel plate had been removed. Behind it, for exposed toggles waited. I pressed the only combination that felt wrong enough to be useful. The car dropped, not descended. Dropped with that sudden stomach-lifting violence of mechanical surrender, then caught itself with a jolt that threw us against the cage walls. The lights went out. For 3 seconds we fell in total blackness while voices moved in the shaft around us, close and unhurried, repeating fragments of things I had said to Daniel years before visiting hours ended. When the lights returned, the gate opened onto the chamber from my first glimpse in the cold open. A round containment space beneath sublevel 7, wider than any structure above should have allowed, ringed by catwalks and observation platforms from different eras welded into one another without design coherence. The concrete walls descended in ribbed arcs toward darkness below the central grating. Cables and old restraint chains hung slack like roots. At the innermost platform stood dozens of versions of me in a loose circle, and in the middle sat Daniel, not restrained now, waiting. Some of the Marcuses were injured, some older, some younger. One wore the uniform I had first arrived in months earlier, uncreased and confident. One had blood dry on his cheek. One smiled. One wept silently. All of them turned as I entered. Simmons stopped behind me. "I never came this far," he said. "That frightened me more than the chamber itself." Daniel stood. The copies parted for him with the courtesy of attendants making room for a physician. Under the hanging lights his face shifted from my brother's to something adjacent and back again, as if recognition required constant maintenance. "Do you know what it's been doing?" he asked. I didn't answer. "It wasn't replacing people," he said. "Not at first. It was practicing continuity." Another me, older, hollow-cheeked, whispered, "Same thing in the end." Daniel ignored him. "It needed rules because rules gave shape. Shape gives prediction. Prediction gives survival. That's what they taught it down here. Observe. Repeat. Improve." "What are you?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "That depends which part of me you loved." Something moved under the grated floor below us, vast and slow. The copies all looked at me with unbearable concentration. And for the first time since I had entered Blackridge, I understood that the entity beneath the prison did not want merely to escape. It wanted a self that could persist outside containment. It wanted one version good enough to keep. Officially, nothing unusual happened at Blackridge. There was a temporary communications failure during a localized night shift disturbance. One inmate fatality was recorded in the segregation unit. 2 officers took medical leave for stress-related conditions. A maintenance fire in an obsolete lower service corridor required partial closure and generated several conflicting internal reports later resolved through review. That is the official language. The problem with surviving a place like Blackridge is that survival does not prove singularity. A man can walk out of an event and still have no defensible claim to being the same person who entered it. Sometimes I think that is the real function of institutions like prisons and hospitals and long care facilities. Not to keep bodies in, but to make continuity negotiable. Months passed, or seemed to. I continued working at Blackridge. At least I retained the badge, the locker, the shift assignments, and the memory of continuing. Every external sign confirmed it. My pay deposited. My supervisor nodded to me in hallways. Simmons remained on nights, though we spoke less and with a formality that felt staged, like colleagues who had once shared a crime and chosen not to name it. I never filed a report about sublevel 7. That sentence should disturb me more than it does. Some days I remember why I didn't, because no language available to the institution would have preserved what I saw without feeding it into a form designed to erase it. Some days I remember trying and finding the page already filled in, signed in my hand, stating there had been no unauthorized access below intake. Some days I remember dying in that chamber and understand my current employment as one more administrative convenience. Memory at Blackridge became conditional after that night. There were mornings I woke in my apartment convinced I had escaped the prison entirely, resigned, and spent weeks somewhere along the coast under a name I did not recognize. By lunch, the certainty would be gone, replaced by the mundane fact of my badge clipped to my belt and the smell of institutional coffee in my sleeve. Other days I remembered Daniel leaving with me. In those memories he sat in my passenger seat on the drive north, gaunt and quiet, watching the road with hollow patience. He asked whether it was raining. I told him yes. When I looked over again, the seat was empty but warm. I no longer trusted memories simply because they hurt. Blackridge resumed its routines the way damaged organisms do, favoring function over truth. The upper blocks remained loud and human. The administrative wing kept its polished corporate sterility. The lower levels were restricted further than before, with new access panels and revised escort logs that made Sublevel 7 even harder to trace. A few staff vanished from rosters. New hires arrived. Somebody repainted corridor arrows. The institution metabolized the event into procedure. Then the rules changed. I discovered that by accident during orientation relief for a new night intake class. Werner stood at the front of the room with the same board authority, handing out laminated cards to 5 recruits who still believed they had taken jobs at a difficult but comprehensible prison. I watched one young officer read the list and fight the same smile I must have worn months earlier. There were 8 rules now. I took one of the spare cards after the session ended and read them under the hum of the vending machine in the break room. The first 7 were familiar, though the phrasing had shifted in subtle ways. Rule 2 now specified occupied observation windows. Rule 5 added regardless of visible weather conditions. Rule 4 read never enter sublevel 7 alone or with anyone wearing your face. Then I saw the new line at the bottom. If Officer Marcus Hale tells you the rules have changed, do not believe him. For a long time I simply stood there, the card balanced in my hand, listening to the refrigerator motor click on behind me. At the bottom of the laminate, beneath the revision date, was the authorizing signature.
Marcus Hale.
My signature, not a rough imitation, not the almost right versions I had seen in altered reports.
Mine.
Pressure pattern, slant, the drag on the final stroke of the H. I knew it the way people know their own laugh even when recorded. I had no memory of writing it. I went to Simmons first because despite everything, I still measured reality against whether he looked surprised. He read the card without reacting. Did I sign this? I asked. Yes. When? A few weeks ago. Why don't I remember? His gaze shifted past me to the corridor, checking for listeners out of habit or fear. Maybe because remembering would force a choice. What choice? He handed the card back. Whether you wrote it as a warning or a cover. That answer stayed with me because it implied the worst possibility, which was not that I had been replaced, but that I had cooperated. In the weeks after that, new officers began watching me carefully. I could see it in the way they paused when I spoke about procedures, the way they glanced at the card in their pockets if I lingered too long in a corridor. Once, trying to help a recruit named Patel who had heard matching footsteps in lower intake and frozen in visible panic, I told him quietly, "The rules aren't enough anymore." He looked at me like I had leaned close to bite him. Then he backed away and quoted Rule 8 to my face. I laughed. Couldn't help it. The sound frightened him more than if I had shouted. That was when I began to suspect the final cruelty of the system beneath Blackridge. It had learned not only how to mimic people, but how to weaponize uncertainty about who was trying to save whom. A warning from me could be true. It could also be the exact mechanism by which the prison refreshed its own unpredictability. Trust and distrust had both become usable tools. If I was still myself, I had been discredited in advance. If I was not, the rule was necessary. Either interpretation served the same end. No stable ground. Tonight, if time still behaves well enough for that word to mean anything, I am back on C Block North. The air smells like bleach and hot wiring. The inmates are quieter than usual. Rain taps somewhere high on the narrow windows, or maybe the sound is coming from pipes. It is difficult to tell now. A prisoner in 233 asked an hour ago if it was raining outside. I told him yes. He smiled with sympathy. On my current route, the polished steel panel at the end of the segregation corridor gives back a clear reflection. My face looks tired. Older, maybe, or more practiced. Hard to say. The badge says I am Officer Marcus Hale. The card in my pocket says not to believe me if I claim the rules have changed. The loudspeaker has been silent all shift. Simmons transferred off nights last week. Or died last month. Depending on which roster I trust. I have come to understand one thing with certainty. The entity beneath Blackridge once needed rules because it needed behavior it could predict. It needed boundaries in order to learn where people ended and imitation began. It has had years to improve. Now the prison trains new staff with revised instructions, altered phrasing, and built-in distrust. Now copies do not always wait for mistakes. Now memory itself arrives pre-argued. I am on the lower corridor outside the old fire door when I hear the second set of footsteps behind me. Perfectly matched to mine. Same pace. Same weight. Same small hesitation in the left heel from an injury I no longer remember receiving. The old rule is immediate in my mind. Stop moving for exactly 30 seconds. Once I would have obeyed. Maybe once that would have saved me. I keep walking. The steps behind me continue for 3 beats, then stop. I do not turn around. Ahead, at the far end of the corridor, the service elevator indicator lights up for a floor that does not appear on the panel. Somewhere deep beneath the prison, below concrete and tile and sealed observation rooms, something shifts with the slow satisfaction of a living thing no longer interested in being contained. It doesn't need the rules now. It only needs people who still think they do. The deeper pages of Vale's report were worse. She believed the reflection had advanced beyond passive copying sometime during the 7th patrol after the initial experiments. It began testing instructions, introducing contradictory rule sets, observing which humans obeyed which kinds of authority. It discovered that guilt made people easier to direct, because guilty people were more willing to believe the harsher instruction must be the true one. It discovered that groups under uncertainty would split faster over memory than over evidence. It discovered that if you mixed enough genuine warnings into a chain of manipulations, humans would help choose the reality most useful to the intelligence making the comparison. At the back of the report, scribbled in pen rather than typed, was a line that felt addressed personally, though it predated me by years. If you are reading this and believe the duplicate is your enemy, you are behind. The thing making the duplicate is the enemy. The duplicate may only be another witness. That explained the figure outside the glass pointing inward. Not threat. Direction. Maybe help. Maybe bait. On the compartment speaker behind us, my own voice said, "Now you understand. Open the stern hatch and we can isolate the source." Ellis swore under his breath. A second later, another version of my voice came over the emergency handset clipped to the wall. "It is the source. Do not let Brooks touch the controls." We all turned to Brooks. He had moved without any of us noticing. One hand rested on the transmission console panel. His expression was unreadable, not vacant but deeply intent, like a man listening to a frequency just below hearing. "Brooks," I said. He looked at me with something almost compassionate. "You keep thinking in singles, Lieutenant. One boat, one patrol, one self. That's why it hurts so much. Step away from the console. You saw it, didn't you? Outside the glass. It isn't copying anymore. It's editing." Halvorsen drew his sidearm. Not standard on internal duty, but the captain had begun carrying one since the crew stopped agreeing what constituted reality. Brooks did not flinch. "I need everyone," Brooks said softly, "to stop speaking as if you know which version of saving yourselves means anything." Then the hull gave a long, low groan beneath the ice, and every light in the module failed at once. In the darkness, 2 things happened together. Someone reached for my sleeve, and somewhere very close, I heard myself begin to speak. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. 3rd rule set. When you encounter yourself, do not allow either version to speak first. When emergency lighting came back red and weak, Brooks was gone. The observation port showed only black water. But on the fogged inner edge of the glass, written in a fingertip trail from the inside of our compartment, were 3 words. It understands you. That was the moment the fear changed. Until then I had feared being replaced. After that, I feared being understood by something that had no business understanding human beings at all. The reactor emergency began at 0217 ship time, or 0206, or 0229, depending on which clock you trusted. By then, the Vanguard had stopped behaving like a single vessel in any useful operational sense. Reports arrived before incidents. Men completed actions they later swore they had refused. Engineering called up status checks from compartments control insisted were unoccupied. The duplicate contact on sonar had multiplied into intermittent shadows, then vanished altogether, as if once visual confirmation occurred, it no longer needed the old methods. When the first alarm hit, it sounded wrong. Not louder, closer, as though the source were inside the bones of the ship rather than mounted to bulkheads. Engineering reported rising temperatures in the reactor support systems. Sonar reported internal acoustic echoes inconsistent with machinery layout. Navigation lost inertial confidence for 12 seconds and came back with headings that did not correspond to any plotted track. Then every internal comm circuit opened at once and competing instructions flooded the boat. Captain Halvorsen ordered emergency reactor procedures from control. A second Halvorsen, voice stamped through auxiliary comms, ordered full stern isolation and silence. My own voice instructed engineering to vent secondary pressure immediately. Another version of me warned that venting would synchronize the crossing. Ellis grabbed a sound-powered handset and got 3 different replies from control, each claiming the others were imposters. Men started shouting in passageways, not from panic alone but because one crew member's correct emergency step was another's fatal error. Rule 6 said remain still in darkness. The handwritten Rule 6 said keep moving. Official Rule 4 said investigate the stern hatch. The hidden version said ignore it. The third set said no one goes alone and no one goes twice. Every rule now had living advocates, each speaking from experience real to them. The submarine felt crowded beyond occupancy. I do not know how else to say it. In peripheral glances, I saw motion where no one stood. Doors opened on voices mid-conversation and closed on silence. At one intersection aft of control, I passed Ellis coming one way and, 3 seconds later, heard him call my name from the opposite direction. The stern hatch alarm began sounding continuously. Captain Halvorsen found me outside the research module. Or a Captain Halvorsen did. His lip was split, uniform half-buttoned, eyes bloodshot with the fixed intensity of a man who had finally reached the part of command that no doctrine covered. We isolate aft and scram the reactor if needed, he said. No hatch opening. No external response. That is the order. A second later, the nearby speaker clicked on in his voice. Open the hatch now. This branch is already compromised. He shut the speaker off with the butt of his hand so hard the casing cracked. I asked the question I had been postponing since the observation port. Sir, how do I know you're you? He gave me an answer no counterfeit could have invented because it fit too perfectly into the wound I already carried. You don't, he said. You decide whether I'm asking you to do what your guilt wants. That should not have helped. It did. I made for engineering with Ellis beside me and the boat shuddering around us in pulses that felt like separate impacts slightly out of sequence. In the reactor support corridor we found Brooks at the console bank, along with 2 technicians arguing over vent procedures and a third man I recognized as Seaman Brooks himself, the original Brooks or something like him, standing soaked to the waist in water that had no source and staring at his duplicate with blank hatred. No one else seemed surprised there were 2 of him. That may have been the worst detail of the night. Not the duplicates themselves, but how quickly necessity normalized them. Returned Brooks looked at me and said, If you vent, one of us stabilizes. The wet Brooks said, If you vent, it chooses. Ellis whispered, Don't let either one speak first. As if we had not already failed that rule a dozen times over. The panel alarms escalated. Temperature climb, pressure instability, containment uncertainty. A submarine could survive many things but not indecision during reactor casualties. Training existed precisely because there came a point when choosing wrong was less dangerous than failing to choose at all. I understood then why the reflection liked crises. Human beings became easiest to model when urgency stripped them to pattern. Different instructions crackled from every speaker. Vent now. Do not vent. Scram reactor. Maintain output. Open hatch.
Sealhat.
And beneath all of them, almost too low to hear, my own voice sang from some nearer place, not over electronics at all. You already chose once and 2 men died. Choose. The collision on the Mallory returned in one hard flash. Not the official report, not the alternate rumors, just the moment of private decision before consequence. The maintenance record open on my screen. The option to delay. The temptation to look competent instead of cautious. I had chosen then because choosing felt like control. This time I chose for the opposite reason. Not because I believed the instruction was right. Because I no longer believed certainty was available. I ordered a controlled manual scram and full aft isolation. No vent. No stern hatch opening. I ordered Brooks, both Brookses, restrained away from the panels. I repeated the order until enough men obeyed the version of command I occupied for it to become real in action if not in truth. The submarine convulsed. Lights died. Came back. Died again. Somewhere aft. Metal screamed with a voice too organic to be steel under stress. One of the Brookses laughed. I still do not know which. Ellis and I threw our weight into the isolation wheel while engineering completed the scram sequence. The deck pitched under us, not physically by much, but enough to produce the sickening sense that we had shifted sideways through something rather than merely moved within water. Then, abruptly, the alarms began resolving. Temperatures dropped. Pressure stabilized. Comms cleared one channel at a time until only standard emergency traffic remained. When I looked back, there was only one Brooks in the corridor, bound at the wrists and staring at me with exhausted contempt. Wet to the waist. Whether that meant the original had remained or the other had better preserved continuity, I could not say. We survived. At least the operational definition of the word still applied. The Vanguard completed its patrol and surfaced weeks later into a harbor that looked exactly like home and wrong in details too small to defend. The skyline near port included a construction crane I did not remember. The weather report on the pier mentioned a storm that, according to my memory, had hit 3 states north the previous month. My sister Leah hugged me and asked whether I was still planning to visit Dad's grave in July. Our father was alive, or had been when I deployed. I checked my phone that night and found photos from a Thanksgiving dinner at a house I had never visited, with people tagged by names I knew and faces I did not. News headlines referenced a refinery fire in Baton Rouge that I had no memory of occurring. My own service record listed a 6-month training detachment in Connecticut I had never completed and a commendation for crisis leadership during an onboard casualty on a patrol whose dates did not match the patrol I had just returned from. I did not report any of this. Neither, as far as I could tell, did anyone else. Maybe that was part of surviving. Not coming home unchanged, but coming home into a place altered just enough that protest sounded like illness. Sometimes I told myself we had made it back to a neighboring reality and that the differences were administrative, survivable. Sometimes I thought the wrongness was much deeper and I only recognized the surface errors because they were all my mind could bear. What I knew was this. The Vanguard had returned to port. I could not prove it had returned to ours. I spent 3 months ashore trying to behave like a man who had simply completed a difficult deployment. I filed reports in the language permitted by classification and self-preservation. I omitted the observation port. I omitted the duplicate voices. I omitted the fact that I no longer fully trusted the continuity of my own memories from one day to the next. Nobody pushed. That was its own warning. Leah continued referencing conversations we had never had. My father, alive indisputably, though thinner than I remembered, asked whether I was sleeping better than after the Connecticut incident. I had never served in Connecticut. At a grocery store near the base, I froze in front of a magazine rack because a headline mentioned an election result I would have sworn had gone the other way. Small things, always small enough to dismiss individually. Together they formed the outline of a life adjacent to mine. I tried to resign my commission twice. The first request vanished in processing. The second came back deferred due to strategic staffing needs, and an attached note from Personnel Command suggesting my experience aboard the Vanguard made me uniquely suited for continuity operations. I never learned what continuity operations meant on paper. I knew what it meant beneath ice. Ellis called me once from a number that did not stay in my phone afterward. He said only, "Have you checked your deployment packet yet?" It arrived the next morning. Orders reassigning me to the USS Vanguard for another Arctic patrol. Same language as before. Strategic value. Specialized experience. Report date, berth assignment, required certifications. Tucked behind the standard pages was an additional sheet labeled Updated Anomaly Procedures. My hands had already started shaking before I read the contents. There were 7 rules. I remembered 6. The first 6 were close enough to the official list I had originally received to make my stomach turn, though details had shifted. Hull knocks now included a note about rhythm. The instruction regarding one's own voice had been revised to say do not answer immediately rather than disregard the content. The 7th rule had no prior equivalent. 7. If another version of you claims this is not your reality, do not ask which one it belongs to. I read it 3 times. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note in dark ink. The handwriting was mine. Not similar. Not potentially. Mine down to the way I crossed my T's slightly too high when writing in haste. The note said, "We chose wrong last time." I had no memory of writing it. For nearly an hour I sat at my kitchen table trying to decide whether the fear on my face belonged to the current moment or was being remembered from somewhere else. Finally, I opened my desk drawer and took out the folded page from Dr. Vale's report, the one I had stolen from the research module. The sentence there had not changed. The reflection improves with every crossing because every crossing teaches it what human beings will do when forced to choose who counts as real. I thought then that maybe the 7th rule was not a warning against madness. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe asking which reality belonged to whom only strengthened the comparison. Maybe the only way to remain functional was to stop demanding ownership of the world you woke in. That was a philosophy suited to cowards and survivors alike. By then I was no longer sure of the difference. I reported as ordered. The docks smelled the same as every naval pier I had ever known. Diesel residue, wet rope, salt, old paint. The ordinary physical world remained offensively intact, which was perhaps why men kept trusting it. Sailors moved stores aboard. Line handlers shouted. Gulls circled over the harbor in bright, indifferent arcs. The Vanguard sat moored and massive and black, its hull giving nothing away. Captain Halvorsen greeted me at the brow with the expression of a man who had once watched me drown in a different weather. "Lieutenant Mercer," he said. "Sir." For a second I thought he might say something that acknowledged the impossible. Instead he only added, "You know the procedures." I almost laughed. Inside, my bunk was exactly where I remembered it. Locker labeled. Blanket folded. The berth above mine empty. I checked under the mattress immediately. Nothing. That should have relieved me. Didn't. It only meant the game had changed. When final boarding was called, I made one excuse about paperwork and stepped back out onto the pier for air I did not need. The hatch stood open behind me. Men's voices echoed down through steel. Somewhere inside, a tool struck metal with a ringing note that made my shoulders tighten. Across the harbor, beyond a line of moored support vessels and a shimmer of diesel haze, another submarine sat at the dock. Same length, same dark hull, same sail number, another Vanguard. It was far enough away that I could tell myself the perspective was wrong. The light distorted, some maintenance vessel accidentally arranged to mimic familiar lines. Then someone walked along its casing and paused near the bow, turning just enough that sunlight caught the white of a cap. He looked exactly like me. I blinked. The harbor held only one submarine. A bosun on the pier called that the hatch was closing. I turned back. For one wild second I considered running. Resignation be damned. Career be damned. Reality itself be damned. Then I thought of the note in my own hand. "We chose wrong last time." That implied 2 things I could not bear and could not ignore. That some version of me had survived long enough to write it, and that he believed another choice still existed. So I boarded. The hatch closed overhead with the heavy final sound I had heard in dreams on shore. Steel sealing steel. The outside world reduced to memory and pressure and whatever waited underneath both. As the locking dogs spun into place, the lights flickered once. Not enough for anyone else to remark on. Just enough for me to see, reflected in the polished edge of the passageway hatch. Another face layered over mine for the fraction of a second before the image steadied. Mine older, more tired, almost kind. His lips moved soundlessly. I did not let him speak first.